Hi and welcome to this video. So this is a kind of onboarding documentation to explain how the front end works and how you can begin coding for it. And this isn't a complete thing of how to do it, but it will give you an introduction to it, and then you can watch some more videos to understand the technical parts better. So before we start, there's a few quick links here, and I'll put a link in the description of this video to this. So then you can click it and you don't have to try to type it in from here. But the top one is the documentation for Dolphin Flashcards. Then the next one is the GitHub site where the code is stored. And then the one at the bottom is the actual site. So if you want to go to Dolphin Flashcards and start using it, then you can use the one at the bottom. And so then what will we look at? Well, we will look at how the front end and the back end work. And then we will look at React. And the way we will do that is we'll first look at traditional web development, and then we'll compare it with React, which is a framework built on top of the normal web development languages, and it kind of improves on them and it builds on them. But I feel like it's important to understand at least the context of where React is built in to kind of fully understand it and to get better at it. Once we've done that, we will look at something called Git and we will look at how that works, and then we'll finally look at kind of what we need to do when making changes. What files, documentation files do we need to edit? And so then looking at how the front end and the back end works. So the front end is coded in React and the back end is coded in Python, and they're separate and independent programs, and they communicate over something called an API, so an application programming interface. So this means that you can run the front end program on its own without running the back end, and you can run the back end without running the front end. But of course, to properly use them, they need to work together and they need to run together. Otherwise, they won't really work properly. But you can run them independently, so they're kind of separated and they're independent. And so this is what then links into this layered architecture, where you've got the front end code, then that talks to the back end code, that then talks to the actual database. And so then to look at this in more practice, we will look at what happens when this dashboard page is loaded. So what happens when we sign in and we get this page? Because the first thing that happens is our computer makes a request to the front end server, and it says to the front end, "Hey, I'd like to get this kind of the dashboard page." And so the server gives your computer the dashboard page, and then your computer displays it. But when it first gets it, it looks similar to this, except it's got no data. So for example here, you can see it's got a 0-day streak. First of all, when it's actually fetched from the server, it doesn't have that number, so it just says day streak. It's got none of the data. So for example, where you can see total XP 290, it doesn't have that. Where you can see the goals at the bottom, it doesn't have that goal. It's just got the broad format of the page, but no data at all. So the next step that needs to happen is the front end then makes a request to the back end server, and it says, can I have all the data? So for example, it says, can I have the number of days streak that the user has? And then the back end will fetch that from the database and to return it, and then the front end will display that. And then it says, okay, I'd like the total and the weekly XP then. And then it sends another request to the back end. The back end gets that data from the database and it sends it back to the front end. And then the front end says, okay, please can I have, the goals now, all the goals that the user has, which you can see here. And so then the back end receives the request, it gets the data from the database, and it fetches it back, and the front end displays that. And so that's how the API works, where the front end kind of displays, what the website looks like, but to get the actual data, it needs to talk to the back end. And so then looking at traditional web development and how that works to give the context to React, we've got three languages that we use. So we use CSS, JavaScript, and HTML. And one analogy you can use is kind of like building a house. So when you build a house, you need to have the four walls, you need to have a roof, so you need to define the main structure of a house. There's four walls and a roof, maybe it's got some windows. So you define the kind of broad structure, but then you also need to make it look nice. You need to add carpet, you need to paint the walls and so on. And then you also need to make things work. You need to get the lights wired up, you need to get the plumbing done. And so this is kind of how a website works, where when you have a website, you need to define the structure of the website. What text does it have? What buttons does it have? What format does it have? And all of that is defined with HTML. So HTML kind of builds the structure of it, where it kind of tells you what does a page have, what text does a page have. And also, if you already know this, you can skip ahead. But if you don't know this, then I'll continue explaining. So then once you've got the main structure of the house or of the web page, then you need to define how things look. And that's how you do that with CSS. So CSS allows you to do things like, I want this text to be blue. I want a button to be blue. When I click it, I want it to change color. And so all of those things you can define with CSS. So HTML is for the structure of the web page. What does the web page have? And CSS is for how does it look like? What colors does it have? What animations does it have? And then JavaScript is to actually make it do something. So for example, if you want to have a sign in button where you click the button and it signs you in, JavaScript would actually make that happen. So you can make it so when you click the button, it signs you in, then it loads the dashboard page, for example. That's all down to JavaScript. So JavaScript defines how things actually work. HTML describes what things are on the page, what text is on the page, what buttons are on the page. And then CSS is used to define how things look, what colors they have, what animations they have. And so then in the project, imagine if you're developing, for example, a dashboard page, you're probably going to have an HTML page called something like dashboard.html, which has the main thing of I want a text here, I want a graph here, I want a button here. Then you'd have a dashboard.css page saying, I like the button to be blue, I want the text to be black. And then you also have a JavaScript page saying, when I load the page, I want you to display the correct data in the graph. I want you to make the sign in button do things. And so then you'll have three separate files probably. You'll have an HTML file, you'll have a JavaScript file, and you'll have a CSS file. So there's three separate files, and the reason React is different is because it combines some of them together. So instead of having three separate files, it kind of combines them together, which is a lot better, and we'll look at that in more detail in a second. So this is an example then of what HTML and CSS look like. And you could also add JavaScript to make it do stuff, like when you add a button or something. And you don't need to worry about what this code means. You just need to focus on the highlighted part. So for the HTML, we're defining h1, which means header 1, which is a big header text. And then we're saying, I'd like to display the text hello world as a big header text. And then in CSS, the highlighted things as color red. So we're saying, I'd like to make the h1 element, I'd like to make the header, I'd like to make it red. And so then that's kind of how it works. So now we'll be looking in more detail about how JavaScript actually works. And so the last section was about how traditional web development works. React is a framework built on top of that to make things a lot easier. And so this is the kind of section you need to focus more on, whereas the previous section is just kind of giving the context of where React fits in. So what are the aims of this section? Well, the thing is, learning React takes time and practice, and this section won't teach you how to use React, it'll just give you a high-level thing. The best way to actually learn React is to actually start using it, because that's more fun, and you also can't really learn it at all from the theory, you actually have to do it in practice. But hopefully, at the end of this video, and at the end of this section, you'll understand the basics of how React works, and then you can learn what you need to do yourself by looking at YouTube videos and that sort of thing. And then also another thing is hopefully you understand how the project and how Dolphin Flashcards is set up in terms of some of the file structure. So then this is some React code, and it's some code that's actually used in practice, and it defines what a header looks like. So then here you can see what the header looks like. So on the left-hand side, we've got the code, and on the right-hand side, we've got what this code actually looks like when it's rendered in the web page. And so then this is one of kind of the main headers that are used in Dolphin Flashcards, and you'll see this header kind of everywhere. And so it's quite an important header. So then if we look at this in more detail, the first line is how you get React working. You have to import it. So yeah, that's the first step. And also note that this code isn't quite HTML, CSS, or JavaScript because it's something called JSX, which is kind of like using all three at once. So it's quite powerful. And we'll see this later, but it lets you use JavaScript code directly within HTML, which is really powerful. And using traditional HTML, CSS, and JavaScript doesn't let you do that. Okay, so then the first step then would be to import React, first of all, to be able to use the React code and React libraries. The next one is to import another file, and this file is called header.css, and this defines things like the colors of the header and that sort of thing. We'll look in more detail in a bit about what actually it defines. So first of all, we're importing two files. And then the next step is to say function header. So we're creating a function called header, and a function is a piece of code that you define once and use it anywhere. So then here we're defining a function called header, which draws a header on the screen, and so we can use that in other places. Now this type of function that draws something on the screen is called a component. So a component is anything you see, like text or a button, or this header here. And components can also include other components. So for example, an entire page, like the dashboard page for Dolphin Flashcards, is a component, and it contains more components like buttons and text and that sort of thing. So to conclude, a function is a section of code that you can define once and use anywhere, and any function that draws something on the screen, like a button or text, is also called a component. So in other words, a component is a button or text or that sort of thing, anything you can see really. And so then it's important to know what a component is because it comes in later. And so in other words, a component is something you can see on the screen, and how React works is it's built up around components, which we'll talk about later. So here we're creating a function called header, and then we pass it some information. So text is just whatever text these will be shown in the header, and then the next part is the style, which we'll kind of skip over for now, because it's not as important. And then we've got color. The color can be blue or black, and this code says if you don't actually pass it, so if you don't actually define the color, then just make it blue by default. So that's what equals blue means. It says set it by blue to blue by default if you don't actually define it. Whereas if you look at text isn't set to anything by default. It doesn't have equals after it. So if you don't pass text, then the component won't work properly. Whereas if you don't pass color, it will just have the default value of blue. And so the next question then is how is this actually used? And this is what we will look at now. So here we're defining a constant called class name. And so a constant is different to a variable, which you may have seen before. Both a constant and a variable are essentially a value that we store and we give it a name. So for example, you could have a username equals Jacob, for example. So that's kind of the key is called username and the value is called Jacob. So you can think of it as like a bucket where you put some information in it and then you can get that back at a later stage where the name of the variable is like the name of the value. But a constant is different to a variable because with a variable you can change the value it stores anytime. That's why it's called a variable, because a value can vary. But with a constant, the value is a constant, and so it can't change. You define it once and then you can't change it again. And the reason why we're using a constant here is because we don't need to change the class of the header, the class name of the header, once it's been created. And I'll explain in a second what a class name is and what a class is. And so then the class name can either be header black or header blue. And so then this is then used by the CSS to decide what style to give it. We'll look more in this in more detail, but next we'll just look at how it decides whether the header is a header black header or whether it's a header blue header. So this is a different version of the code, and it's kind of given in more detail so it's easier to see, but it's saying if the color that you pass to the function, you can see at the top there where it says color equals blue, if you pass a color and the color is black, then you need to make the class name header black. But if the color isn't black, which it's probably going to be blue, then you need to make the class name header blue. So if the color is blue, then the class name is header blue. If the color is black, the class name is header black. Also notice where the line that says if color equals black, there's 3 equal signs here. And if you've done programming before, you may have seen 2 equal signs before, but not 3 equal signs. And it means basically the same thing. There's some slight difference, but it doesn't really matter. But you can think of 3 equal signs as being more or less the same as 2 equal signs. So returning back to that previous line, this line is a shortened version of what we just saw, and because it's shortened, that means it's quicker to write. And we don't need to worry too much exactly about what this means, because the syntax can be a bit confusing at first, but it's basically saying if the color is blue, then make the class name header blue. If it's black, then make the class name header black. And as with anything, and with programming as well in general, it'll become easier once you begin to use it more and more. And that's the thing with programming, it can be hard at first, but then it gets easier and easier the more you begin to practice. So we're nearly finished now, and looking at what return means, it says when the function is finished, return some value. And this entire syntax is something called JSX, which is from React, and it kind of combines what JavaScript, what HTML, and what CSS do at the same time. And how JSX works is everything above this return statement, everything we've seen so far, is more or less JavaScript code. It's slightly different to JavaScript, but it's more or less the same sort of syntax. And so if you copy and pasted it in a JavaScript file, it would probably run without many problems. But everything inside the return statement, so everything we will see next, is more or less HTML code. So if you copy and pasted it and put it in an HTML document, it would more or less run without a problem. So what we're going to see now is more or less HTML code. And so these curly braces that you can see at the start of the return and at the end of it kind of define the section that will be returned once we finish the function. So everything inside here is what will be returned once we finish the function. And this is actually what defines the header itself. This is actually what means we have a header to show. So P means a paragraph, so it's, in other words, some text. And there's an element which is given to you from HTML. So HTML defines this is what a paragraph is, but we're going to customize it further. So here we're setting what class the paragraph has, whether it's a header black or whether it's a header blue paragraph. And so the class is derived from the thing we had above. So remember, we've got the line const class name can be header black or header blue. This is then where that class name is used. And a class is kind of basically a label you can give to elements, which you can then use to customize it later with CSS. So for example, maybe this paragraph has a class name of header black. So we label it and we say, hey, this is a header black paragraph. Then in CSS, we can say, okay, make every single header black paragraph, make it black. Or we could say this is a header blue paragraph. And then in the CSS, we can say, okay, every single header blue paragraph, let's make it blue. And so this is how the class name works. It's kind of a tag which we can then use later. And then another thing then is we're setting the text of the function to be the text passed to the function. So basically, within this paragraph, within this paragraph, we say we want to display text. And text is passed to the function, which you can see at the top there. And so this is what defines the actual text that shows in the paragraph. And we're defining a variable then directly within the element. And you can't do this with normal HTML. You'd have to do it in a more complicated way. And so this is why React is a lot better than normal HTML. So then we're passing the text to the paragraph. And these curly braces you can see around text means everything inside is going to be code and it's not going to be plain text. And you can see that with where it says class name equals class name. The second time we use class name, it's got curly braces around it. So instead of using just a plain text value class name, we are actually having it as a value of the variable. So instead of just saying, okay, the class name is class name, we're saying, no, actually, the class name is header black or header blue, because that's going to be the value of the class name variable. So everything inside curly braces is actually JavaScript code or JSX code, which is kind of more or less the same as JavaScript with extra things added. Like, for example, we're defining an HTML paragraph here, which you can't do directly in JavaScript code. And then finally, we're exporting the function so we can use it in other places. So then quickly, here's the CSS for the header blue class. So when we assign header blue as a class to the paragraph, then this code is run, which makes the header blue and does some other stuff. So then this, where it says header blue, this is what actually decides which type of paragraph to assign it to. So it only makes headers blue if they've got the class of header blue. And the dots you can see just by header blue means every single class called header blue. So for example, you can say you can have a styling that you apply to every single paragraph element or every single element with a certain ID. But here we're saying apply this to every single class, which is called header blue. And so then in here, we're defining how things look. So things like the color and the font size and that sort of thing. And you never know all the available options for CSS. So you can just Google it, or you can ask ChatGPT to do how to do things that you don't know how to do. And that's the kind of the fun thing with programming. You can just Google things, you ask ChatGPT, and that's completely fine. As long as you get the job done, then you've done it. So then in a summary, hopefully you know a bit of the basics of how React works. And the issue is you won't learn React from this because it takes longer to learn it like this. It takes longer to learn React, and then also you need to learn it in practice. You can't just learn it in theory, you need to actually learn it in practice. But you'll hopefully have a very high level gist of what coding in React is like. And then importantly, hopefully you understand now what a component is, which is important for the next section. And so a component then, to say again, a component is something like a button or text. It's some UI thing that you can see on the screen.